I want to talk a bit about crime and the lockdown, but I want to be a little bit specific on this because crime obviously covers a huge field. I've just seen a report on CNN which was interesting. It was dated the 28th of April, which is, well, today. Um, I don't know if it's pre-recorded because of the social distancing. I'd imagine looking at the footage, it probably was somewhat pre-recorded. But basically, it was about a man in Detroit and a particularly notorious neighborhood of Detroit known as the Red Zone because the gang warfare there is so bad. He'd lost his own brother in a shooting, and he'd taken this initiative to try and get the gangs to come together, um, to have some sort of communication, at least in that neighborhood, as a way to reduce the violence. Detroit, of course, is notorious for its homicide rates, as are other big Midwestern cities, Chicago, St. Louis. Um, but this got me thinking about, firstly, the initiative. I have huge respect for what the man's doing. He's personally suffered. He lost his brother, and yet he's taken this on. Um, and I really, really hope it's successful. And he said the initiative was to get young people away from crime before it gets them. Now, we've heard this many, many times, and I don't want to be overtly cynical because I think what the man's doing is very admirable. And some of the gang members said that they felt a positive energy with it. But it's also hard to ignore the fact that there has been a lot of well-intentioned people who have tried similar things in inner city areas, and ultimately, I believe it comes down to criminals themselves. I think ultimately, I mean, you could talk about tackling the root of the problem. And as he and the others featured in the video mentioned themselves, there's not one single issue or one single reason for Detroit's problems. There's a lot of them. Detroit, of course, seriously declined. It's the only city in America that surpassed 1 million people to go under 1 million people. Um, in that sense, it's somewhat similar to some cities in northern England, although the crime rates are much higher. But in terms of I mean, here in Sunderland, we've had industrial decline. Sunderland doesn't have the gang problems that Detroit has, not on the same level anyway. But there is poverty here. Um, the thing with these inner city areas, they're hellholes, really. Um, And there's no simple solution to what goes on in those places. There's no simple explanation for what goes on in those places. I mean, I have a huge amount of respect for people who really put themselves into those situations. My last video was on fear. Well, if you're some sort of social worker or community activist, quite often you're from the area, so at least you know it. But one thing struck me in the video, it was about 8 minutes long. It said, no one's going to come in to help us. My response was, well, is it any wonder? Outsiders won't want to be shot. So there is a fundamental principle at play here, and this is perhaps my more conservative side coming in. It's responsibility. Because you can blame the government, you can blame the city government, you can blame the police, but in the end of the day, the change has to begin at the base. So one of the gang members interviewed said both his parents are drug addicts. Well, I can't imagine what that would have been like. Must have been horrendous. But then you could argue you're a grown man. It's up to you to break the cycle. Okay, so you had a terrible childhood, but you're a grown man now and you have the intelligence to break that cycle. It's a question of willpower. Will you break the cycle? And I think that's a fundamental question when it comes to gangs because it's always about, oh, I do it for survival. And I think that it's probably true. They probably do have to survive. But the point is, they all have that mentality. I carry a gun to protect myself. That's what we get in London and in Birmingham. Gang members are always, they justify their knife carrying. We have a serious knife problem in this country. I do it for self protection, but they all do it. If you're carrying a knife, you intend to use it. So, what I liked about this initiative was it was putting responsibility at the base. It wasn't just about, oh, the government's done this wrong, they've done that wrong, the city council has done this wrong, they've done that wrong, the police, there was a focus on self responsibility. The guy said at the end, no one's going to come in to help us but ourselves. And he's right. And I think that it's not that the outside world doesn't care. I think it's that insiders know it better than others. I mean, there's already, all the tensions that go on between police and the black community in the United States are obvious. Um, and as for people coming in from the outside, it takes a brave person to do that, to go into an inner city area. So I think it has to begin at the base. He said at the end, our idea is to get young people away from crime before it gets them. And I'm broadly supportive of that, but we've had a similar argument in the UK, and I mean, obviously, everything depends on whether a scheme like this will work or not. But the argument in the UK is rehabilitating them before it gets worse. But the point of that was in the Detroit case was it's before the crime is committed. I would say where there has been an offence, there has to be responsive. I mean, this may be a slight difference with the American situation. In Britain, I think it's more a case of a change in attitudes. I think American cities have always been dangerous. I think that's a slight difference. I think in Britain, our situation's got worse over the last 3 decades. In the United States, it's always been bad. So if you look at the homicide rates for Detroit or Chicago in the 70s, they were just as bad as they are now. In fact, even worse. I think Chicago was averaging 900 murders a year. It's now about 700. Still very bad, but it was actually the peak homicide rate for a lot of American cities was in the 1970s. In the UK, we've seen a rise in violent crime in the last 3 decades, so that's perhaps a difference. And I think in the case of the UK, that's why in this country I'm very critical of the idea of, oh, we rehabilitate them before it gets worse. But the point is, it's already bad when a 16-year-old is stabbing someone for disrespecting them. So you can't say that's rehabilitating because the action's already happened. That's not a preventative measure, that's acting after the fact. And it isn't even acting, it's not justice. So I think the problem in Britain is actually a change in attitudes. Um, there's just been a more lax attitude to personal responsibility. In the United States, I would say there is differences because there's more of a racial component there. There's more of a racial history there. Um, so yeah, maybe it would be wrong to make an exact analogy. But with the lockdown, get to the point, I really shouldn't. Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. In the big American cities, the lockdown is in place. I understand in Chicago, or it was either Chicago or Detroit, the homicide rate wasn't changing, so maybe the lockdown was having no effect, ostensibly because criminals don't care. But the thing is, if they cared about the virus, I mean, presumably they don't want to die from gunshots. I imagine they don't want to die from a virus either. So criminals are selfish by nature, but if it was a case of self-preservation. I mean, what's interesting is we're seeing some very notorious parts of the world, the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and the shanty towns in Cape Town. In both examples, in the favelas, it was the organized criminal gangs. I think one of the most notorious ones called the Command of the Capital, and of course, Brazilian cities are even more dangerous than American cities, um, where they were actually enforcing the lockdown in in Cape Town, the gangs were coming together to distribute food. Now, one city official there said, "This isn't going to be a get out of justice free card. You know, these are still ruthless men who've killed people." So, coronavirus, it'll be interesting to see over time if it has an impact on crime or not. If it actually makes offenders themselves stay at home. In the UK, what we're having is a situation, the sort of people who are violating the regulations are the sort of people who had contempt for authority to begin with. I mean, I was shopping the other day, I was getting food, and there were a few people out clustering in groups. It's against the rules. They were clearly drunk, spitting on the ground. There was police about 50 meters away. Well, not close on that, would have been 20 meters away. You know, clearly within eye focus of these people. And they were doing nothing. So there's certain kinds of, I mean, that would be an offence of breaking the regulations, but there is still a contempt for law going on. And I wonder, will we see a reduction in homicide rates or not? Because then there's other problems. There could be an increase in domestic violence. So maybe a little premature to think that the lockdown and coronavirus could actually have a radical cultural shift. Anyway, what do you think? Do you think that the lockdown measures could actually make these inner city areas have a reflection on themselves? Because if the gang members themselves don't want to get the virus, if they're actually self-isolating, not because they're obeying the authorities, but because they don't want to get the virus, um, I mean, could that actually be a time for them to reflect on the way of life? Could this actually have radical changes? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts.